Receptionist at luxury five-star hotel kicks out elderly man for his dirty clothes. But he was the new owner. New York City, 2019. The opulent lobby of the Empire Suites Hotel glistened under the brilliance of crystal chandeliers. Marble floors reflected the grandeur of the towering columns, and the air was scented with a faint, expensive perfume. Guests dressed in tailored suits and designer gowns flowed through the space, their footsteps muffled by plush carpets. Nathan, the young and ambitious front desk receptionist, stood behind the polished mahogany counter. His tie was perfectly knotted, his name tag gleamed, and his expression exuded professionalism. Nathan prided himself on working in such a prestigious establishment. Every day, he greeted high-powered executives, celebrities, and wealthy tourists with the same calculated charm. But tonight, as he scanned the lobby with his sharp eyes, a figure caught his attention. The man shuffled through the grand revolving doors, his steps heavy and deliberate. He was older, likely in his late 60s, and his appearance clashed starkly with the luxury surrounding him. His coat was tattered, its fabric frayed at the edges, and his jeans were stained with dirt. Scuffed boots carried him slowly across the polished marble floor. His unkempt gray beard framed a face lined with exhaustion, but his piercing eyes held an intensity that couldn't be ignored. Nathan's instincts kicked in. Something was off. This man didn't belong here. The young receptionist tightened his posture, shooting a subtle glance at the security guard stationed near the lobby entrance. "Good evening, sir," Nathan said, his tone carefully neutral. "How can I help you?" The older man stopped in front of the counter, resting his hands on it. His fingers were calloused, and his nails were rough, further betraying his haggard appearance. "I'd like to speak with the manager," the man said, his voice gravelly yet steady. Nathan raised an eyebrow, his mind racing. The request was odd, especially coming from someone who looked like they'd just walked in off the street. His initial reaction was suspicion, but he masked it with a polite smile. "Are you sure you're in the right place, sir?" Nathan asked, his tone teetering on condescension. The man didn't flinch. "Yes, and I'll also need a private meeting room," he said plainly. Nathan's polite facade began to crack. "Sir," he said slowly, as though speaking to a child, "this is a luxury hotel. If you're seeking shelter or assistance, there are other facilities in the city that can better accommodate your needs." The older man's gaze sharpened, but he didn't respond immediately. The tension between them was palpable, and Nathan felt the curious stares of other staff and guests. The receptionist knew he needed to handle this quickly and decisively. "I'd still like to speak with the manager," the man repeated, his voice unwavering. Nathan sighed, already impatient. "I'm sorry, but I'll have to ask you to leave," he said firmly, motioning to the security guard. Within moments, the guard was at the man's side, gently but insistently guiding him toward the exit. The older man didn't resist. He paused only once, at the revolving doors, turning to look at Nathan with an expression that was unreadable. Then he disappeared into the bustling city streets. Nathan exhaled, relieved that the awkward situation was resolved. Another odd disruption dealt with, he thought. As he adjusted his tie and returned to his duties, he had no idea that he had just made the biggest mistake of his career. Outside, Sebastian stood on the sidewalk, pulling his frayed coat tighter around himself as a cool wind blew through the Manhattan night. His sharp eyes scanned the glowing windows of the Empire Suites, the hotel he had quietly purchased just weeks ago. He had come unannounced, dressed simply, to see how his staff treated people they thought didn't matter. Now he had his answer. "Interesting," Sebastian muttered under his breath, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. Slowly, he walked away from the hotel, already plotting his next move. The cold wind of the New York night cut through Sebastian's tattered coat as he walked slowly down the bustling street. Taxi horns blared and pedestrians rushed past him, lost in their own lives, oblivious of the man who moved at his own deliberate pace. To them, he was just another weathered soul in a city that swallowed people whole. But Sebastian had lived enough years to know better than to care what strangers thought of him. He was here for a purpose. Sebastian had come a long way to this moment, though few would guess it from his current state. Beneath the shabby clothes and worn boots lay a story of triumph and tragedy. He was a man who had seen the best and the worst of life, who had built empires only to watch them crumble. He had learned the hard way that wealth didn't shield you from loss, and that success could never fill the void left by the people you love. Tonight wasn't about proving anything to anyone but himself. Sebastian stopped at a small corner cafe, its fluorescent sign flickering. Inside, he ordered a cup of black coffee, paying with a crumpled bill pulled from his pocket. He sat near the window, sipping slowly, his mind drifting back to the life he'd once lived. 30 years ago, Sebastian had been a titan in the business world. Born into a modest family, he'd clawed his way to the top with relentless determination. By the time he was in his 40s, he owned a string of successful companies and had built a reputation as a shrewd but fair businessman. His greatest achievement, however, had been his family, a wife and 2 children who were the light of his life. But life has a way of tearing down even the most carefully constructed worlds. The memory of the car crash still haunted him. It had been a rainy night, the kind where the city streets turned slick with danger. His wife, Caroline, and their youngest son, Max, had been driving home from a school play when another driver ran a red light. The collision was devastating. Both of them were gone in an instant. Sebastian's world shattered. For years, he threw himself into his work, trying to outrun the grief. His daughter, Emily, grew up distant, feeling the weight of a father who was physically present but emotionally absent. Eventually, even his business empire began to crumble under the weight of neglect and poor decisions. By the time he reached his 60s, Sebastian had lost almost everything. Almost. With the little he had left, Sebastian made a comeback. It wasn't about reclaiming his fortune. It was about finding purpose again. He invested wisely, started small ventures, and built them into something meaningful. Slowly but surely, he rebuilt his life, though he kept a low profile. Wealth no longer interested him in the way it once had. What mattered now was connection, understanding people, and leaving a legacy of kindness in a world that often lacked it. The Empire Suites had been his most recent acquisition, a decision born not out of business ambition but personal conviction. Once, this hotel had been a place of celebration for his family, where they'd stayed during holidays and special occasions. Buying it was a way of honoring their memory. But he wanted to ensure that the people who ran it treated others with dignity, regardless of appearances. That's why he'd come tonight, deliberately dressed in the old clothes he wore during his long walks through the city. It was a test, one that Nathan and the rest of the staff had failed spectacularly. As Sebastian stared out the cafe window, his eyes followed the glowing lights of the Empire Suites in the distance. He could still feel the sting of Nathan's dismissive tone, the judgment in his eyes. It wasn't the first time Sebastian had been underestimated, but it never failed to strike a chord. He finished his coffee, leaving a small tip on the table, and stepped back out into the cold night. People see what they want to see, he muttered to himself. Sebastian wasn't angry. He'd seen too much of life to waste energy on anger. But he was disappointed. Disappointed that a young man like Nathan, with so much ahead of him, had already fallen into the trap of judging people by their appearances. As he walked back toward his modest apartment on the outskirts of the city, Sebastian allowed himself a small smile. They'll know soon enough, he thought. Nathan's night had been chaotic, though not in the way he had anticipated. The incident with the elderly man lingered in his mind. Despite his efforts to shake it off, he told himself he had done the right thing. After all, his job was to maintain the pristine reputation of the Empire Suites, not cater to every odd character who wandered in off the street. Still, Something about the man's piercing gaze haunted him. Nathan straightened his tie and adjusted his posture, hoping his outward appearance would reflect the confidence he wanted to feel. He glanced at the lobby clock, 10:15 p.m. His shift wouldn't end for another few hours, but the usual sense of pride he felt working at the luxury hotel was dulled. Instead, a nagging unease crept into his chest. He pushed the feeling aside and focused on the task at hand. A couple in evening were approached the front desk, and Nathan greeted them with his practiced charm. He had perfected the art of the polished smile, the measured tone, the polite efficiency. To the outside world, Nathan was the ideal concierge. Reliable, knowledgeable, and impeccably professional. But beneath the polished surface, Nathan carried a heavy weight, the burden of ambition. Growing up in a small town in upstate New York, Nathan had always dreamed of escaping the monotony of his rural life. His family wasn't poor, but they lived paycheck to paycheck, and the idea of luxury had always seemed like a far-off fantasy. Nathan had watched his parents work tirelessly, sacrificing their dreams to provide for him and his siblings. Their sacrifices had inspired him, but they'd also left him determined not to repeat their struggles. Nathan wanted more. He wanted to live in the world of tailored suits, sparkling chandeliers, and Michelin-starred dinners. He didn't just want to witness wealth. He wanted to embody it. The opportunity to work at the Empire Suites felt like his first real step into that world. From the moment he landed the job, Nathan threw himself into it with everything he had. He arrived early, stayed late, and studied every detail about the hotel's operations. He memorized the preferences of regular guests, learned how to anticipate requests before they were made, and made sure his supervisors noticed his dedication. But Nathan's drive for success came at a cost. His co-workers often teased him for being too uptight, calling him a perfectionist behind his back. And while his supervisors praised his work ethic, they also hinted that he needed to loosen up and show more warmth. Nathan didn't care. He wasn't at the Empire Suites to make friends. His goal was to climb the ladder, to move from receptionist to management, and eventually to a position where he could afford the kind of life he'd always dreamed of. Yet, tonight, his carefully constructed facade had cracked. As he replayed the interaction with the elderly man, Nathan couldn't shake the feeling that he'd been too harsh. His instincts had told him the man didn't belong, but now he questioned whether he had let his own biases cloud his judgment. Nathan's thoughts were interrupted by the approach of his manager, a sharp-eyed woman named Laura. She was the type of leader Nathan admired, confident, no-nonsense, and unapologetically ambitious. "Nathan," she said, her voice brisk. "Everything okay here tonight?" "Yes, Ms. Hayes," Nathan replied immediately. "Just the usual." Laura's eyes narrowed slightly. "I heard there was an incident earlier." Nathan hesitated. "Just a minor disruption," he said carefully. "An older gentleman came in, but he wasn't a guest. I handled it." "Handled it how?" "I asked him to leave. He didn't seem like the type of clientele we catered to." Laura studied him for a moment, her expression unreadable. "Nathan, we're in the business of hospitality. It's not just about who fits the image of our guests. It's about how we make people feel. Even when they don't belong here, you need to be tactful." Her words stung more than Nathan expected. He nodded, mumbling an apology, but inside, frustration bubbled. He had done what he thought was right. Why should he feel guilty for protecting the hotel's reputation? As Laura walked away, Nathan stared at the gleaming countertop in front of him. He wanted to brush off her comments, but a small voice in the back of his mind whispered that she was right. Was his ambition blinding him? Had he sacrificed kindness in his relentless pursuit of success? He shook his head, dismissing the thought. Tomorrow was another day, another chance to prove himself. But as the lobby grew quiet and the echoes of his polished shoes faded into the silence, the memory of the elderly man lingered. Nathan didn't know it yet, But the man he had dismissed so quickly would soon turn his world upside down. The following morning at Empire Suites began like any other, with the staff bustling to prepare for the day. Guests trickled down for breakfast, and the hotel's elite reputation was on full display. Neatly arranged floral centerpieces, the soft murmur of classical music, and the aroma of freshly brewed coffee wafting through the air. Nathan arrived early as usual, determined to shake off the unease from the previous night. He had convinced himself that the incident with the elderly man was behind him, a minor hiccup in an otherwise impeccable shift. Adjusting his tie and smoothing his perfectly pressed uniform, Nathan took his place at the front desk. But the tranquility of the morning didn't last long. Shortly after 9 a.m., a black limousine rolled to a stop outside the hotel. The driver, wearing a crisp uniform, stepped out and opened the door. Nathan and the other staff instinctively straightened their postures, their trained eyes recognizing the arrival of an important guest. Out stepped a tall, sharply dressed man in his 50s, his tailored suit exuding wealth and authority. He carried himself with an air of confidence that demanded attention. Following closely behind him was someone Nathan didn't expect to see again. It was the elderly man from the previous night. Except now, he wasn't wearing his tattered coat or scuffed boots. He was dressed in a sleek navy suit, his beard neatly trimmed and his silver hair combed back. He looked completely transformed, though his piercing eyes remained just as sharp. Nathan's stomach dropped. The staff exchanged confused glances, unsure what to make of the scene unfolding before them. Nathan struggled to compose himself, his mind racing. Who was this man, and why was he here again, this time arriving in a limousine? As the elderly man approached the desk, Nathan instinctively stepped forward, his professional demeanor faltering. "Good morning, sir," Nathan said, his voice wavering slightly. "Welcome back to the Empire Suites. How may I assist you today?" The man didn't respond immediately. Instead, he studied Nathan with a faint, enigmatic smile, as if savoring the moment. "I believe we've met," the man said, his voice steady and calm. Nathan swallowed hard, unsure of how to respond. The man's presence carried a weight that unsettled him, and the memory of their interaction the night before flooded back. Before Nathan could say anything, the sharply dressed man who had arrived with the elderly gentleman stepped forward. "This is Mr. Sebastian Grant," he announced, his tone formal. "The owner of Empire Suites." The words hit Nathan like a freight train. For a moment, the lobby seemed to fall silent. Nathan's heart pounded in his chest as the weight of the revelation sank in. The man he had dismissed and humiliated last night wasn't just another visitor. He was the owner of the very hotel Nathan worked so hard to protect. The staff around Nathan froze, their expressions a mix of shock and panic. Whispers rippled through the room as they tried to process what they had just heard. Sebastian's gaze never left Nathan. "Interesting, isn't it?" Sebastian said, his tone light but laced with meaning. "How appearances can be deceiving." Nathan stammered, his usual polished composure crumbling under the pressure. "Mr. Grant, I didn't realize." Sebastian held up a hand, silencing him. "Let's not dwell on last night," Sebastian said, his voice calm but firm. "What matters now is what we do moving forward." Turning to the sharply dressed man beside him, Sebastian added, "Shall we proceed to the meeting room?" "Of course, Mr. Grant," the man replied. Sebastian walked past Nathan without another word, leaving the young receptionist standing frozen at the front desk. As the two men disappeared into the hallway leading to the private meeting rooms, the staff erupted into murmurs. Nathan could feel their eyes on him, their silent judgments pressing down like a weight on his shoulders. He wanted to sink into the floor. Nathan couldn't focus for the rest of the morning. Every time he replayed the moment he learned Sebastian was the hotel owner, his stomach churned. He had spent the night rationalizing his actions, convincing himself he had done the right thing for the hotel's reputation, But now that justification felt hollow. What haunted him even more was Sebastian's reaction, or lack thereof. The man hadn't raised his voice, demanded an apology, or publicly humiliated him. Instead, Sebastian's calm demeanor made the entire situation feel infinitely worse. Nathan wasn't sure if he should feel grateful or terrified. By noon, whispers about the encounter had spread to the hotel staff. Some were sympathetic, while others barely concealed their amusement. Nathan felt trapped under their judgmental gazes. He wished he could rewind the clock and handle the situation differently. But time wasn't something he could negotiate. Shortly after lunch, a bellboy approached Nathan at the desk with a message. "Mr. Grant would like to see you in the private lounge," the bellboy said, avoiding eye contact. Nathan's heart sank. He nodded and forced himself to smile. "Thank you," he replied, though his voice came out hoarse. As the bellboy walked away, Nathan wiped his damp palms on his slacks and took a deep breath. This was it, his moment of reckoning. The private lounge was one of the most opulent spaces in the hotel, reserved for VIP guests and high-level executives. As Nathan stepped inside, the plush carpeting muted the sound of his footsteps. Chandeliers glittered overhead, and floor-to-ceiling windows offered a stunning view of Manhattan. Sebastian was seated in a leather armchair near the window, sipping a cup of tea. He looked completely at ease, as though he had all the time in the world. "Nathan," Sebastian said without looking up. "Please sit." Nathan hesitated for a moment before taking the seat across from him. He felt like a schoolboy summoned to the principal's office, his confidence stripped away. "I imagine you've had a difficult morning," Sebastian began, his tone even. "Yes, sir," Nathan admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I want to apologize for last night. I didn't realize—" Sebastian held up a hand, cutting him off. "Stop. I don't want apologies." Nathan blinked in surprise. "What I want," Sebastian continued, setting his teacup down, "is for you to tell me why you acted the way you did. And be honest." Nathan swallowed hard. His first instinct was to give a polished, rehearsed answer, but something in Sebastian's gaze made him hesitate. This wasn't a man who tolerated dishonesty. "I thought," Nathan began, choosing his words carefully. "I thought you were a homeless man who wandered into the hotel. I was worried about how it might look to the guests if you stayed in the lobby." Sebastian raised an eyebrow. "And you thought the best solution was to ask me to leave?" Nathan nodded, shame washing over him. "Yes, sir. I thought I was protecting the hotel's image." For a long moment, Sebastian didn't respond. He simply studied Nathan, his expression unreadable. Finally, he leaned back in his chair. "Do you know why I built Empire Suites?" Sebastian asked. Nathan shook his head, unsure if he was supposed to answer. "It wasn't to create a place where only the wealthy could feel at home," Sebastian said. "It was to create a space where anyone, regardless of their background, could experience dignity and respect." Nathan felt a lump form in his throat. "I didn't always have this," Sebastian continued, gesturing to the luxurious surroundings. "There was a time when I was the man you thought I was last night. I slept on park benches. I scavenged for food. People looked at me the same way you looked at me last night, with disdain, with fear, with dismissal." Nathan's eyes widened. He hadn't expected this. "I built this empire because I wanted to prove that people like me, people who've hit rock bottom, are still worthy of respect," Sebastian said, his voice tinged with emotion. Nathan's guilt deepened with every word. "Now," Sebastian said, leaning forward, "I don't tell you this to make you feel bad. I tell you this because I see potential in you. But potential means nothing if it isn't paired with empathy." Nathan was stunned into silence. "I'm going to give you an opportunity," Sebastian continued. "Not a punishment, but a lesson." "What kind of lesson?" Nathan asked hesitantly. Sebastian's lips curved into a small, knowing smile. You'll find out soon enough. Before Nathan could respond, Sebastian stood and extended a hand. Nathan shook it, the warmth in Sebastian's grip catching him off guard. Take the rest of the day to reflect, Sebastian said. We'll talk again tomorrow. Nathan nodded and stood, his legs feeling shaky. As he left the lounge, he couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just a lesson. It was the start of something that would change his life forever. Nathan arrived at the hotel the next morning, his mind still swirling with the events of the day before. He barely slept, haunted by Sebastian's words and the weight of his own actions. He couldn't shake the image of Sebastian sitting across from him, calm but piercing, recounting his past as a homeless man. Nathan knew this lesson Sebastian had mentioned would be no ordinary task, but he had no idea what awaited him. Shortly after clocking in, Nathan was called to a conference room by one of the senior managers. As he stepped inside, he found Sebastian sitting at the head of the table, his expression unreadable. Beside him was a middle-aged woman with a clipboard and a sharp, no-nonsense demeanor. "Good morning, Nathan," Sebastian said, his tone as even as ever. "Good morning, Mr. Grant," Nathan replied, trying to mask his nervousness. "This," Sebastian said, gesturing to the woman, "is Ms. Harper. She's in charge of special projects for Empire Suites. Today, you'll be assisting her with something a little unconventional." Nathan's curiosity deepened, but he kept quiet, nodding in acknowledgement. Ms. Harper stood, her heels clicking against the polished floor as she moved toward him. "Nathan," she began, "Mr. Grant has devised an exercise for you. It's a bit unusual, but I believe you'll find it illuminating." Nathan's heart raced. "What kind of exercise?" Sebastian leaned forward, resting his hands on the table. "I want you to experience what it feels like to be invisible, overlooked, dismissed. Just as I once was." Nathan blinked, confused. "I don't understand." "You will," Sebastian said with a small smile. "Ms. Harper will provide you with the details. But for the next 48 hours, you won't be Nathan, the front desk receptionist of Empire Suites. You'll be someone else entirely." Nathan's stomach churned with apprehension. Ms. Harper handed him a sealed envelope. Inside, you'll find a new identity, complete with a name, backstory, and specific instructions. You're to live as this person for the next 2 days. No exceptions. Nathan hesitated, staring at the envelope as though it might explode. "And what happens if I fail?" Sebastian's smile faded, replaced by a serious expression. "Failure isn't an option. This is about more than your job. It's about understanding the core values of this company and, more importantly, yourself." Nathan swallowed hard and nodded. "I'll do it." An hour later, Nathan stood in a dingy, unfamiliar part of the city, his heart pounding in his chest. Gone was his crisp suit and polished appearance. He wore a second-hand coat, patched at the elbows, with worn-out sneakers and jeans that barely fit. His hair was intentionally disheveled, and a smear of dirt on his cheek completed the transformation. He felt utterly exposed. The instructions in the envelope were clear. Nathan was to assume the role of Eli Roberts, a man who had recently fallen on hard times after losing his job and home. He was forbidden to use his real name, access his bank account, or contact anyone he knew. For the next 48 hours, he would live as someone with nothing but the clothes on his back and a small amount of cash for food. Nathan wandered the streets, clutching the instructions as though they were a lifeline. He had been assigned specific tasks: visiting a soup kitchen, seeking shelter in a crowded drop-in center, and even approaching strangers to ask for help. Each task seemed designed to push him further out of his comfort zone, forcing him to confront the reality of life on the margins. The first few hours were the hardest. Walking into the soup kitchen, Nathan felt the weight of judgment from others, though he wasn't sure if it was real or imagined. He avoided eye contact, keeping his head down as he shuffled through the line for a simple meal of soup and bread. The food was warm, but the humiliation left a bitter taste in his mouth. Later, he visited a shelter, where he was met with skeptical glances from staff and other residents. The shelter was overcrowded, the air heavy with the scent of unwashed bodies and desperation. Nathan found a spot in the corner and sat silently, his discomfort growing by the minute. But the most humbling moment came when he was forced to approach strangers for help. Time after time, he was ignored, brushed off, or met with thinly veiled disdain. "Sorry, man, I don't have anything," one person said, walking away without meeting his eyes. "I can't help you," another muttered, clutching their purse a little tighter. Each rejection felt like a blow to his pride, chipping away at the confident, polished persona he had spent years building. As the hours dragged on, Nathan began to understand the depth of Sebastian's lesson. For the first time in his life, he felt truly invisible. By the end of the first day, Nathan sat on a park bench, exhausted and emotionally drained. The city lights twinkled in the distance, but they offered no comfort. He thought about Sebastian's story, about the man he had judged so harshly just a day ago. For the first time, he realized he didn't just pity Sebastian, he admired him. Nathan woke up on the second day of his immersion feeling stiff and disoriented. He had spent the night in a crowded shelter where sleep was a luxury. The thin, musty mattress offered little comfort, and the constant hum of noise, coughing, murmurs, and occasional outbursts had kept him on edge. His polished world of luxury and order felt like a distant memory, replaced by a harsh, unrelenting reality. As he stepped outside into the cold morning air, clutching his worn coat tightly around him, Nathan felt a pang of something he hadn't fully recognized before: fear. Fear of being overlooked. Fear of being stuck in a cycle that seemed impossible to escape. He glanced at the crumpled task list Sebastian's assistant, Ms. Harper, had given him. Today's instructions included spending the morning at a community center that offered resources for the homeless, such as showers, job listings, and counseling sessions. Nathan trudged through the streets, his feet aching in the ill-fitting shoes. He avoided his reflection in shop windows, unable to reconcile the person he saw with the one he had been just 2 days ago. The community center was already bustling when he arrived. Volunteers moved with practiced efficiency, handing out towels and toiletries to those waiting in line. Nathan joined the queue, keeping his head down. The man in front of him, an older gentleman with a weathered face and a gentle smile, turned and nodded at him. "First time here?" the man asked. Nathan hesitated before nodding. "Yeah, don't worry," the man said kindly. "It gets easier. People here are good folks." Nathan swallowed the lump in his throat. He hadn't expected kindness, especially not in a place like this. After a quick shower, his first real moment of solace in 24 hours, Nathan sat in the common area, sipping a cup of weak coffee. He listened to the chatter around him, snippets of stories that painted a vivid picture of struggle and resilience. "I used to work construction before the accident," one man was saying, his voice tinged with regret. "I'm just trying to save enough to get my kids back," a woman murmured, clutching a photo of 2 smiling children. Their words struck a chord deep within Nathan. He had spent his life behind the front desk of a luxury hotel, catering to guests with endless resources and grand demands. He had never truly considered the lives of those who didn't have the means to walk into Empire Suites, let alone stay there. By midday, Nathan's next task took him to the city's busiest intersection, where he was instructed to spend an hour observing people. It sounded simple, but standing on the corner with no destination, no purpose, felt excruciatingly vulnerable. The crowd surged around him. Businessmen in tailored suits, tourists clutching maps, mothers hurriedly pushing strollers. Nathan watched as they passed by, their gazes sliding over him as if he didn't exist. He felt the sting of their indifference, the same sting he had unknowingly inflicted on others. After a while, His instructions required him to approach a nearby diner and ask for a meal. Nathan's pride rebelled against the idea, but hunger and curiosity won out. He entered the small, bustling establishment, the aroma of sizzling bacon and freshly brewed coffee making his stomach ache. "Excuse me," he said softly to the woman behind the counter. She was middle-aged, with kind eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. "What can I get you, hon?" she asked, wiping her hands on her apron. I don't have any money," Nathan admitted, his voice barely audible. "But if there's anything left over..." The woman didn't let him finish. She grabbed a plate and began piling it with scrambled eggs, toast, and a few strips of bacon. "Here you go," she said, sliding it across the counter. "Everyone deserves a hot meal." Nathan blinked, stunned by her generosity. "Thank you," he said, his voice cracking. "Don't mention it," she replied, her smile warm but matter-of-fact. As he sat down to eat, Nathan felt an overwhelming wave of gratitude and shame. He had judged people like her for so long, assuming their kindness came with strings attached or hidden motives. But now he saw the truth. There was beauty in small acts of humanity. The final task of the day was perhaps the most difficult. Nathan was instructed to return to the shelter where he had slept the previous night and engage in conversation with someone about their story. He chose a young man named Caleb, who couldn't have been older than 25. Caleb spoke with quiet intensity, describing how he had aged out of foster care with no family or safety net. "One bad month," he said, "and I was out on the street. It's crazy how fast it happens. One day you're fine, the next..." Nathan listened intently, nodding, his chest tightening with every word. Caleb's story could have been anyone's, a stark reminder of how fragile stability could be. By the end of the second day, Nathan was physically and emotionally drained. As he walked back to the designated meeting point with Ms. Harper, his mind raced with everything he had seen and felt. He was no longer the same person who had stood at the front desk of Empire Suites, polished and self-assured. Sebastian had been right. This experience was more than a lesson. It was a reckoning. Nathan stood at the edge of the park, the chill of the evening air biting at his skin. It was the final hour of his 48-hour challenge, and he was exhausted, mentally and physically drained. He had learned more about himself in these 2 days than he ever could have imagined. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the city, Nathan could almost hear the echoes of his old life. The confident, unyielding receptionist of Empire Suites, the man who had once looked at people like Sebastian with disdain. Now, he felt different, changed. His hand shook slightly as he reached into his coat pocket, pulling out the crumpled list of tasks Sebastian had assigned him. The last instruction was simple, yet powerful. Return to the hotel. Do not tell anyone who you are. Do not reveal your identity. Live the experience until the very end. Nathan knew this was his final test, his final moment to prove to himself that he understood the lesson Sebastian had been trying to teach. It wasn't just about walking in someone else's shoes. It was about seeing people for who they truly were, not just the label society placed on them. As he entered Empire Suites, Nathan was met with the usual buzz of activity, the hum of conversations, the ringing of phones, and the shuffling of employees running errands. But to him, everything seemed distant now, as if he were an observer, not a participant. He walked past the marble floors, the opulent chandeliers, and the polished gold accents, noticing details he had once overlooked. He noticed the tired eyes of the staff, the exhaustion behind their professional smiles. He saw how they carried the weight of expectations on their shoulders, just like he had once done, just like everyone did in their own way. The front desk was bustling as usual. Nathan's former colleagues, dressed in their crisp uniforms, greeted guests with practiced warmth, making small talk and managing the flow of arrivals and departures. But to Nathan, they seemed like actors on a stage, playing their roles without ever truly seeing each other. His heart pounded in his chest as he approached the counter. There, standing behind the desk as he had done countless times, was the new receptionist, Claire, a young woman with a bright smile and a sharp wit. She didn't notice him at first, focused on her task of checking in a family of 4. Nathan hesitated. He wanted to speak to her, to somehow explain everything that had happened over the past 2 days, but he didn't know how. How could he possibly convey the depth of what he had experienced? "Can I help you, sir?" Claire's voice broke through his thoughts. Nathan met her gaze, his heart in his throat. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. For the first time in his life, he wasn't sure how to articulate what he had learned. He didn't need to say anything. As Claire continued to check in the family, Nathan noticed her quick, practiced movements, the ease with which she navigated the complicated systems and demands of the job. He remembered when he had been like that, effortlessly gliding through the motions, living in his comfortable bubble of privilege. But now, he saw the world differently. Turning away from the desk, Nathan wandered into the lounge area, his eyes scanning the room. He saw a group of businessmen sitting at one of the plush leather chairs, talking shop, their voices low and authoritative. A couple sat nearby, sipping cocktails, laughing together as they exchanged private jokes. He saw a woman with a young child, clearly tired from a long day of travel, her eyes flickering with anxiety as she checked her phone. The hotel, once a sanctuary of wealth and power, now felt like a microcosm of the world itself, a place where people hid behind facades, unsure what to do with their own vulnerability. Nathan's chest tightened as he thought about Sebastian, the man he had dismissed, the man who had shown him the truth. It wasn't just about how people looked. It was about who they were beneath the surface. Sebastian had never needed luxury or status to be powerful. He had lived through hardship, fought through despair, and yet he had remained grounded in his values. He hadn't judged Nathan for his arrogance or his ignorance. Instead, he had seen something in Nathan that even Nathan hadn't recognized in himself: the potential to change. And change, Nathan realized, was the hardest thing to face. He thought back to his time with Caleb at the shelter, the young man whose voice had been so full of quiet pain. He remembered the older man at the community center, whose words of comfort had seemed so simple yet profound, and the woman in the diner, who had given him food with no expectation of anything in return. It hit him then, with a force that nearly knocked the breath out of him. These people were survivors. They had been stripped of everything, but they still found ways to live with dignity. They didn't need luxury or status. They didn't need the approval of others. They simply needed to survive, to endure. A surge of emotion welled up inside him, and Nathan felt tears sting his eyes. For the first time in his life, he understood what it meant to be truly alive, not just in the sense of survival, but in the sense of truly connecting with others, of seeing them as equals. He turned back to the front desk, where Claire was finishing up her work. As if guided by some invisible force, Nathan stepped up to the counter. "Claire," he said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. I'm not who you think I am." Claire looked up, raising an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" Nathan swallowed hard. "I was once just like everyone else here, judging people based on their appearance, assuming that the value of a person is tied to their wealth or status. But I've learned something over the past 2 days. We all have our struggles, and we all deserve respect, no matter who we are or what we have." Claire's expression softened. "I didn't know you felt that way." "I didn't know either," Nathan admitted. "Until now." As he spoke, Nathan felt a sense of peace wash over him, as though a heavy burden had been lifted from his shoulders. It was a small but meaningful moment, a glimpse of redemption, a realization that he could be a better person. And as he stood there, finally seeing the world with clear eyes, he knew that he had not only passed Sebastian's test, he had transformed.